Ja, Regine, du erzählst uns jetzt etwas zur Geschichte der Privatsphäre. Was ist das eigentlich, habe ich gehört?
Ja, wir haben schon die 4. PrivacyWeek und nie hat jemand gefragt, was ist Privatsphäre? Was macht ihr da eigentlich? Wie
Ja, dann
definiert
machst du
man
das jetzt, ne?
Genau.
Wunderbar. Großen Applaus für die Regine und Bühne frei.
Danke. Also ich versuche das jetzt nachzuholen, weil wir das nie definiert haben. Und das ist eigentlich erschreckend. Ich glaube, hinterher werden wir auch nicht mehr wissen als vorher, nur ein paar mehr Fragen haben. Was ist Privatsphäre? Bitte. Diskussion kommt hinterher, aber so ein kurzes Statement. Ein persönlicher Raum für sich selbst. Hat noch jemand eine kurze Antwort?
Eine Ergänzung dazu, in dem eigene Gedanken frei von Druck, von Gruppendruck zum Beispiel auch möglich sind.
Eigene Gedanken, ja. Eine können wir noch, traut sich niemand noch was zu sagen? Na gut, dann mache ich eine Zickzackbewegung durch Raum und Zeit. Es ist nicht zeitlich gegliedert, überall, wo ich anstoße, öffnen sich neue Fragen. Es ist einfach in wilder Reihenfolge, reiße ich Aspekte an. Das bin ich, ganz alleine auf weiter Flur. Nachdem da sonst rundherum nichts ist, muss ich mich um Privatsphäre nicht kümmern. Ist völlig egal. Wenn ich alleine bin, stört mich keiner. Ist also völlig egal, was da los ist. Wenn ich jetzt mehrere Menschen habe, dann haben die jeder eine eigene Privatsphäre, was immer das ist. Wenn diese Menschen weit genug voneinander weg sind, stören sie einander nicht. Also wenn das alles ganz dünn besiedelt ist, ist es auch völlig egal, die kommen einander nicht zu nahe, nicht ins Gehege. Jetzt ist es aber, es ist nicht gut, dass der Mensch allein sei. So ein Mensch alleine ist nicht lustig und Menschen leben gerne zumindest paarweise oder in Gruppen. Wenn ich jetzt 2 habe, kommen die Privatsphären einander näher. Was ist jetzt so das absolute Minimum an Privatsphäre? Wo kann ich jetzt gar nicht mehr nachgeben? Ich meine, die Privatsphäre kann ich so oder so definieren. Und machen die Menschen unterschiedlich. Also das absolute Minimum ist meine Haut, mein Kopf. Noch näher lasse ich keinen und so nah eigentlich im Normalfall auch nicht. Das heißt, wenn ich eine Spritze bekomme, eine Impfung, eine Operation, ist das eigentlich Körperverletzung und verletzt meine Privatsphäre. Unabhängig davon, was das jetzt ganz genau ist, es greift massiv in meine Privatsphäre ein. Blut abnehmen. Also alles, was in den Körper hineingeht, das zerstört sogar das absolute Minimum, was ich an Privatsphäre benötige. Jetzt ordnen wir die Menschen einmal paarweise an. In der oberen Abbildung überschneiden sich jetzt die Privatsphären. Die müssen gar nicht gleich groß sein bei den verschiedenen Menschen. Aber da gibt es jetzt Troubles. Wenn sich die überschneiden, muss man irgendeine Lösung finden. Zumindest, wenn sie so nah bleiben wollen, muss zumindest einer nachgeben. Es kann jeder ein bisschen nachgeben oder einer gibt viel nach, der andere gibt gar nicht nach. Das kann also massive Probleme machen. Wer hat jetzt mehr Rechte? Wer sagt dem anderen, was er nachgeben muss? Und wenn es so ausschaut, dann haben wir die Probleme. Ich weiß zwar noch immer nicht genau, was Privatsphäre ist, aber da sind die Menschen zu nah aufeinander. Sei es, dass sie in einem Flüchtlingscamp überbelegt sind, zu viele Menschen in einem Spital beieinander. Wie auch immer, das ist einfach zu viel und das macht massiv Probleme. 1890 Warren und Brandeis haben versucht, das zu definieren in Amerika. Die legen ja ganz, ganz viel Wert auf ihre Privatsphäre und haben versucht, den Begriff irgendwie zu definieren. Und dann eines, was herausgekommen ist, right to be alone. Natürlich, der Mensch will nicht immer alleine sein, aber zumindest muss er das Recht haben, eine Zeit lang alleine zu sein. Wenn jetzt so viele Menschen auf so engem Raum zusammen sind, kann das schwierig werden. Wir in Europa haben feste Häuser und unsere Privatsphäre. Jedes Kind kriegt ein eigenes Zimmer und kann da alleine sein. Das heißt ja nur, man muss die Möglichkeit haben. Man muss es jetzt nicht als Einsiedler leben, das ist es auch nicht. Aber dieses Recht, alleine sein zu können, zumindest für eine gewisse Zeit. Und wenn das nicht gegeben ist, gibt es Aggressionen und wirklich Probleme. Fangen wir ganz willkürlich einmal im Mittelalter an. Da war das mit der Privatsphäre so eine Sache. Die Leute haben zum Teil zu mehreren in einem Bett geschlafen. Würden wir heute als Privatsphäre nicht wirklich mehr akzeptieren. Knechte und Mägde haben im Stall geschlafen, bei den Tieren, auf irgendeinem Strohsack. Und wenn es nur einer war, hätte er vielleicht eine gewisse Privatsphäre.
And if it were just one person, they would have had privacy with the animals, but there were no rights for like real, like human or like citizens, because they were just servants.
Ein Zimmer für jedes Kind hat es nicht gegeben.
But there were no like extra rooms for children.
Und wie viele Leute dann beisammen waren?
And how many people stayed together really depended on where you lived and at which time you lived. Much, much earlier than the Middle Ages. There haven't been that many people in the world. Let's say nomads. In like Kazakhstan, they had yurts where they just lived together and they just moved with their yurts and so their tents. So they just packed their things when there was nothing else for food for the animals, and then they just moved on. They had no real like big houses, and there was no privacy like we define it today in those tents actually. Especially nomads, they were moving all the time. They lived in small buildings just to have some safe space against animals or maybe the weather in the night. Maybe they had some guardians. But in warmer countries, that was not. It was not necessary to have, well, real like tents. But in places like Alaska, with the Inuit, they just lived in igloos. So where they needed it against the weather. And there's no privacy in there in the sense we understand it today. So privacy was not defined by houses and walls, but by rules. And those rules were something the kids learned very early on. It was unthinkable that someone would just enter another family's building. That was just by the rules prohibited. And they learned it very early on because this is private. And this is something you're only allowed to enter if someone tells you, yeah, of course, please come in. And so the right to be alone wasn't really possible there. It was always more than one person in a room. Okay, let's try it from the other side. Let's try about human rights. This is just like the
Das war in Amerika
basic
nach
human
den
rights.
Kriegen 1948 hat sich
In 1984, 48, in the UN thought, okay,
was wäre wünschenswert,
let's
dass
see
alle
what are
Menschen in Frieden
general
miteinander
human rights that are necessary for all people to live together. So, and after the Second World War, people wanted to get a standard for human rights. So-
Roosevelt wollte einen völkerrechtlich verbindenden Vertrag
And so they
haben.
wanted a
Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to have a binding treaty so that every country could sign up and
Mindeststandard
that these minimum standards
berücksichtigen.
would be taken into account by everyone.
Und wer schon jemals bei der UNO war, es
And
gibt
who,
einen Text,
if you've ever been to the
dann sagt
UN,
das eine Land, das wird gestrichen.
there's a text, and each country starts saying that we will delete this line and this line and this line,
Etwas noch weggestrichen haben.
and at the end you arrive at a text where no one has any problems with, but it's very generic and it's not very definite and not very clear for these treatises. And so they have to be,
Also sie haben versucht wegzustreichen, was geht.
Unanimous.
yeah.
Und dann waren 48 Ja-Stimmen und 8 Enthaltungen.
So had 48 yes and 8
Das hat keinen
Abstentions.
verbindlichen Vertrag gemacht. Das heißt, die Menschenrechte sind nicht verbindlich.
okay, and so this didn't realize a binding treaty because not everyone was for it. So
Die
it's
Staaten, die sich
not
enthalten haben,
binding.
waren Saudi-Arabien und Weißrussland.
Saudi Arabia,
And Belarus abstained.
Saint, and some other countries from this
Die
region.
Amerikaner, ja, die halten sich ja auch noch nicht so wirklich dran.
And the Americans, for example, don't really, well, keep them. So we have Article 1, all human beings are born free and equally in dignity and rights.
Akzeptieren viele nicht.
This is something many people don't accept. We have a lot of racists here, we have a lot of racists in the US. So this is, unfortunately,
Akzeptieren die meisten nicht.
not
Jeder hat Recht,
many
Leben,
don't
Freiheit
accept.
und Sicherheit der Person.
Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person.
Auch zum Beispiel die Chinesen haben noch die Todesstrafe.
In the US and China, for example, you still have death penalty or capital punishment. So it's nothing everyone agrees about. Article 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms.
Den hat es in Amerika auch gegeben.
This has also been in the US. Today, it's a bit different. It's rather like kept secret, but not really doesn't exist.
Anwenden wollen. Es gibt keine verbindliche,
So we-
einklagbare, justiziable Grundlage.
So we have no binding legal foundation that it can use to
Da war es so, dass sie unterschiedliche Rechte
go to the
hatten.
courts and
Die griechischen Philosophen
Greek philosophers.
Sklaven haben sie zum Teil ganz gut behandelt.
And
zum
some of
Teil
those slaves were treated pretty well.
viel schlechter behandelt, als
Some
sie
slaves were treated worse than the animals.
ins Haus geholt.
Some were in the household.
So wie bessere Handwerker. Und
People
die
who
konnten auch
know stuff,
Geld
like
anhäufen und konnten sich dann auch frei
Some craftspeople,
in der
they could
Bibel
live
zum
more
Beispiel.
freely than the
Also
others.
da war die Sklaverei
and they
the
could
Bible-
buy their freedom too.
beschrieben. In der Bibel ist
The
auch eine
Bible slavery
Anleitung, wie man
is,
Sklaven schlägt, ohne dass es
Defined, and it's also told how you keep slaves with and how to punish them without being murdered. So if you punish them and they die 3 days later, in the Bible it's not murder.
dass man sie nicht gleich totschlägt.
So
dass sie einfach 3 Tage
if you want to be a good Christian, you have to punish them in a way that they at least live for 3 days on, and then it's okay. At least it's not murder.
Die schlechte Nachricht, es gibt keine gesetzliche Definition.
The bad news, there's
von
no
Privatsphäre, keine
legal
legale
definition of
Definition.
privacy.
Zwar nirgendwo.
Nowhere in the
Sie wird
world,
aber in
actually.
vielen Ländern unterschiedlich.
Of course, many countries have different views on it and treat it differently. So the minimum is the inside of my head and my skin, as we said before, so that's really no one else's business.
Ich hatte mal, ich habe beim Patentamt gearbeitet, eine Anmelderin, die sich furchtbar beschwert
I worked in the
hat.
patent office and I had an applicant that was complaining a lot. This, she said, was stolen from her head.
Okay. We tried to verify that, but it was before she was born. But still, she was convinced that they stole it from her head. Well, obviously, she had a problem, but this is something we really don't want, having things stolen from our heads. So the skin is really the bare minimum of privacy. Brave New World from Huxley, 1932. The book starts with a comment from a
Russian philosopher who, it was in French. Fortunately, we interpreters have had this quote in advance. It's utopias appear to be much more achievable than previously thought. So this utopia from the novel, Huxley didn't believe in that, and he later wrote a re-encounter with the Brave New World. It simply, he didn't mean it so seriously, and even in the 60s, things had become much worse than he had anticipated. And he's now dead. He would be completely upset by the way things are today. So now with the EEGs, the brain scanning and reading, people are reading into the brain, people are put into that tube and they're played something, and it's then observed which signal comes out of that, and which brain signal, and whether that can be reproduced. And if people can learn things that way without actually intruding onto the person's body, the idea is whether something can be, some influence can be exerted. And some people want to actually read out the brain that way, and I'm not talking about prosthetic limbs or something. Prosthetics where the nerves can be used via electrodes to control the prosthetics. That would be the more primitive variant, actually. In Brave New World, Huxley writes, there are state breeding and rearing centers. So people are bred in an artificial uterus. I've seen a patent application. That, of course, is still a utopia, but in 1954, this kind of patent application was there that describes such an artificial uterus. This doesn't work, but it's frightening what people think of, and Huxley describes how people are divided into separate classes, and the simplest people who are not supposed to think so much, they are supposed to work. They receive drugs, and these drugs make them not gain intelligence and stay calm. These days, well, we don't pressurize the pregnant women, but children with ADHD are sedated with medicine, and my opinion is always let them run for 2 hours, then things will look after themselves. It's frighteningly close to the sedation in Brave New World. So we're not that far away from his vision, negative vision. And of course, sedating through medication is an intrusion into privacy as well. And
well, let's look at different aspects. How and at what time can you try to get a hold on privacy? What are the aspects you have to think about? Of course, the anonymous. For copyright reasons, I did it myself again and recreated it. No one knows who I am when I'm anonymous. So a meeting of
Alcoholics Anonymous.
Well, no one knows who I am. They don't give their names. It's not confidential. You say what you went through, what you drink, why you drink, if you do it, and if you are able to admit it. So many people hear it. It's not confidential and it's public, more or less. And the anonymity is very fragile. It's just someone else from the outside comes in who by chance knows me, and there's a problem already in this. So privacy by anonymity is very difficult. It can really go a very wrong way. But sometimes I want to stay anonymous because I'm afraid of something. I want to protect my privacy. I want to read something about an illness or a sickness on the internet. Why do I want that? Is it me who is ill? Is it my child? Does my neighbor have a sick child? Or do I want to study medicine? All of this can be misinterpreted. That's why I want to do it within my privacy. And the anonymity is an aspect of privacy that at least partially is part of it. Collecting metadata really hurts anonymity, because from metadata you can reproduce the, identity of a human. And technical people here will know even the Tor network is not that safe, and anonymity can be circumvented, because also the bad guys try to find out ways to de-anonymize us in the Tor network. So we don't know what privacy is and how people interpret privacy. So what is confident or confidential? Confidentiality is not anonymous, because it's two or more people talking to each other, but all the other people are outside and they're not allowed to know it. But those two people know each other, have been introduced to each other, maybe they're business partners. The other person, maybe like
competition.
a competition, and they are not allowed to know what they speak confidentially. So confidentiality, the more people you have, the more problematic it is to keep up confidentiality, because you just need one leak, you just need one person saying it to someone else, you have a problem. So confidentiality can be breached easily. And I can't tell something confidentially that's part of my privacy, which can lead to huge problems later on in my life. So what's secret? The person in turquoise wants to keep something secret, so she can. But as soon as more than one person keeps a secret, that can be very difficult. And as soon as the secret gets out, my privacy can be hurt pretty badly, depending on the secret. And I know I love this or that person, but the others are not allowed to know, because they will see that they won't like it, so I can keep it a secret to myself. But as soon as many people know that that I love this person, it can pretty easily leak. So it's only secret if you have very few people or just me. Okay. The opposite of private is public. There are things about me which are public, of course, and some things about me are private. Public things are like my name. Each search engine will find my name. That's just something that's public, because I've done a lot of presentations. My address, most likely you'll find it out, because you can ask. My occupation, it's usually public information you can find on the internet. What's private then? Or which sicknesses or illnesses I suffer from? What are like the results of my last health check? What are my handicaps, be they bodily or mentally? What's my religion?
Oder wen
What
ich
do I
gewählt habe
believe?
bei der letzten Nationalratswahl.
For whom did I vote at the last election?
Es gibt da mehrere Privatheiten.
And there are
Meine
like
Kinder
multiple
dürfen andere Sachen
privacies.
wissen als meine Kollegen.
My children are allowed to know other things than my
Mein
colleagues at
Ehepartner
work.
oder Ehepartnerin darf andere Sachen wissen.
My spouse is allowed to know more things about me than the general public.
Verschiedene Stufen, verschiedene Privatheiten.
So you have different
unterschiedliche Sachen, die
stages
wir
of
wissen.
privacy, or some like different privacies.
Aber ich
Some
will
people may know
absolute
about me and others
Kontrolle
won't.
darüber,
But I want total control about who knows what of my privacy. I want to have the control.
Probleme gibt's, wenn etwas, was ich für mich als
Problems
privat
arise
erachte,
if something that I see as private for me, someone else puts into the public space. Like when relationships break up and one of the people just throws something into the public space that I consider private, but the other person doesn't, or just is hurt and so publishes it.
dann habe ich auch die Kontrolle nicht mehr drüber.
And that's the point where I lose the control about my privacy.
Dann gibt es Privatsphären für Gruppen,
There's also something like privacy for groups.
Familien.
For example, families. We have here family Muller and family Meyer.
Gegen die anderen,
We against the others.
gegen den Rest der
We
Welt.
against the rest of the world. The good guys against the bad guys.
Dann die
people.
Familie ist sozusagen
The
ein Kokon,
The family is like
Gruppe,
one group,
aber
of
innerhalb
privacy.
dieser Gruppe wird die Privatheit des
but
Einzelnen sehr oft
within
nicht respektiert.
this group, this privacy group, the privacy of the individual is not
Respected.
respected because the children have to take up a certain occupation. They are not allowed to marry whoever they want. They have to do what their parents tell them. So within the group, the family group, privacy is often ignored for the individual.
Dass die Einzelpersonen Privatheiten haben.
So privacy for the individual
Familie
is
tritt als
neglected,
Gruppe auf,
and the family is a group to the outside, and they are
die nach
the
außen
private
ganz abgeschottet
entity
sind, niemanden
who are
reinlassen,
totally
keine Freunde
isolated
haben.
against the outside. They may have no friends even. It's just we're in our privacy and all the others are bad people, and we don't do this and that, and they don't do this and that, and that's why we are one private entity.
Dann gibt es einzelne Gruppen,
But you can have even
die auch
bigger
eine Privatheit
groups
innerhalb der Gruppe haben.
which have privacy within them, like
Aber nicht
Catholics,
miteinander reden.
Protestants, Muslims,
Ja, innerhalb der Gruppe wird
Jehovah's
die
Witnesses.
Privatheit wieder nicht respektiert.
So again,
Viele religiöse
they have privacy against the other groups, but within those groups, privacy isn't respected. They have very strict rules within their groups about whom I'm allowed to marry. Definitely not someone of another belief. That's out of the question.
Da gibt es einen Witz, dass man sagt, die katholische und
There's
die
a
evangelische
joke
Bevölkerung
which says the Catholic and Protestant groups in one region in Germany have actually separated gene pools because they never intersect with each other and they don't intermarry and don't intermingle.
This interpreter is from North Rhine-Westphalia.
Then you have religious symbols. Religion is something private, but would be private as long as state isn't taking measures in that. If state and church are really separate as far as it should be, then religion is totally a privacy thing and is no problem, which unfortunately it isn't. And the church is helped or supported by the state. In earlier days, we had the person who leads also defines the religion. In Germany, you have the state doing the collecting taxes for the church. In Austria, the Catholic Church doesn't need to pay taxes for like their property, and you have obligatory religious education in the schools.
Sie haben da Sachen, die der Staat unterstützt,
So there are things the state supports in the church, in special churches, so religion is not really a private matter, unfortunately.
Strafgesetz, im Blasphemieparagraphen. Also es ist strafbar, wenn man eine Religionsgemeinschaft verspottet.
So in Austria, it is actually punishable by law if you
Oder nicht, darf man die nicht offiziell in Österreich anerkannt sind, verspotten oder nicht.
you're not allowed to make fun or to make fun of religious groups that are officially in the law in Austria.
Also man kann, wenn man eine Religionsgemeinschaft verspottet, durchaus.
So if you're making fun of a religious group, you can actually go to jail if you're unlucky in Austria.
Leben auf der Straße.
Living on the streets, so being homeless, do those people have any privacy? Any privacy, any kind of privacy?
Wenn sie nur mit ihrem Schlafsack
If they're just sleeping somewhere in the bushes,
haben sie weder Anonymität
they don't have anonymity, nor privacy, nor anything else in that direction.
Jetzt sieht man ab und zu Menschen,
Now
die solche
sometimes
Kurzzelte
you
haben.
see people with small
Damit
tents,
erzeugen sie eine
which they use
gewisse minimale
to create a
Privatsphäre.
minimal privacy for them.
Und das Right to be alone, naja,
But the right to be alone, well, that's another thing.
minimal, dass sie versuchen, eine gewisse
They at least try to get some
zumindest optisch
minimum privacy kind of thing.
zu erobern.
And they try to conquer it and to get it.
Oder Lazaretten hat man sehr oft Tücher aufgehängt, um die
In emergency shelters, sometimes you just put like,
A linen cloth to separate.
which also tries to keep up a very minimum version of
Was
privacy.
heute zum Beispiel nicht mehr möglich war,
To
in den
do-
Römern hat es Latrinen gegeben.
At the Romans, you had
Das
latrines
sind die Menschen beieinander gesessen,
where the
haben
people
ihre
sat
Noten
next to each other
haben dabei
and like
Geschäft gemacht.
went to the toilet, and they just they talked to each other, and up to 60 people together, and they made business contracts just on the toilet.
1000 Jahren schon sowas gegeben. Oder es
It's-
verbirgt, dass Könige in der Früh wirklich
We have stories about kings in the Great Britain who made contracts and held audiences just on the toilet,
undenkbar.
which is something that's totally unthinkable for us.
Wenn man dann
If you have small children
Mama,
and you go to the toilet and you hear, "Ah, mama, mama," and you think, "Oh my God, not even that little privacy I still have."
definieren das sehr, sehr unterschiedlich.
But at that time, it was different. People didn't consider being on the toilet that private. So it's definitely different depending on the space and time where you are. In China,
Das mit der Privatsphäre ganz anders aus.
privacy is defined very differently. You still have public toilets,
Die haben manchmal
which sometimes have walls that just go up to your knees, no doors, sometimes no walls at all. Doesn't matter.
sitzen da nebeneinander,
People sit next to each other
miteinander reden,
and talk to each other, and they want to talk to each other because they're interested. Hey, that's a foreigner, so we can ask them something just because we never see those usually.
Die haben also da ein Empfinden für Privatsphäre, das bei uns
So this is a sense of privacy that's totally unthinkable here in Central Europe.
das andere Extrem sind die Japaner.
The other extreme is found in
Die haben
Japan.
Dinge, die abgeschlossen sind. Multimedia.
They have
sogar Musik,
totally
die
closed
irgendetwas
toilets
hören.
with like multimedia, TVs, radio, so it's not only optical but also audio closed, so no one else should even hear that you're in there.
Etwas, was ich zu diesem Thema noch gefunden habe.
And something else I
Früher
found about this
hat man
topic was that
entweder zu säubern die Hände,
in all the times
Grasbüschel
you
oder
used like grass or bushes or leaves or maybe some sponges to clean your hands. That's why in Quran, like your left hand is not clean because it's the unclean hand, because it's the one hand you use to clean yourself after going to the toilet. Wouldn't be necessary today, but it's
hier ein
still.
altes Patent von 1891.
Here you have an old patent from 1891,
Toilettenpapier
and it's just toilet paper.
kommerziell
It's a patent.
versucht hat zu vermarkten.
And they try to, well, sell it and to make it commercial success from it, and they even tell you how to set it up, how to set up toilet paper, because in 1891 that was something unknown of. In the Netherlands, people don't have curtains. We have like curtains, and we close the doors twice. But in the Netherlands, no, they don't. And still, no one just enters other people's houses. So people create a privacy because people just look away. They don't look into windows. Just foreigners do that. So you don't have to defend privacy by curtains, but if people just know they shouldn't do it, they don't do it. You just look away, and by just looking away, you can respect or recreate privacy of other people if there's no like physical means. That's something else I found. I Am Robot, a German company which creates RFID implements. So you have a chip that's usually also in some clothing, but you can implant it within your hand. You can even choose the color. And you can use it to, for example, to pay for things, which is great for tracking, of course. Someone can tell what you eat. Maybe you're ill and so you eat something special. Do you spend too much money? Whatever. You have to have a bank account in Germany for this thing. And in this case, I would say that privacy can be recreated by using cash. But still, and we have ideas to just banish cash altogether in some countries already. DNA, find your ancestor things. You send your DNA to some laboratory, and then you find people who are related. We've heard already from Philipp Schaumann's talk that if you send the DNA of someone into those laboratories, like a hair with its root, you can categorize 30% of the people until they're like grandparents and their relationships. So if you find multiple people with a similar DNA, you can say they have the same grandparents?
Great-grandparents.
Not without even ever knowing this person, you still can really infringe someone's privacy just by doing this DNA thing. Is food something that belongs to privacy? Am I a vegan, a vegetarian, or maybe even fructarian? It really doesn't matter that much. But some religious groups make very clear and strict rules about what to eat and how to eat it. So you have a group with very strict rules. For example, you're not allowed to eat fishes with scales, but you can eat fishes without those. So you can eat like you can eat them with scales, but you're not allowed to eat like sharks. And so those groups are really different. So in hospitals, you have rights for patients. If you treat multiple patients, you have to, the law says that you have to keep up a certain amount of privacy when you're telling people about what their problem is and about their sickness and about their medication. But that's a problem. How should you do that if people are like in rooms there are multiple people? And you also have and so body scanners on airports are actually a huge infringement of privacy because they just take your clothes off until the bones actually. In jail,
authorities have to ensure a minimum amount of privacy, and so there is some kind of separation. But if someone should try to commit suicide and that gets known, then every 5 minutes someone will come along, and sometimes they're put into a special cell with the kind of rubber walls and a camera watches you the whole time. So you are not allowed to kill yourself because that is a revenge kind of thinking. And people cannot extract themselves or escape the kind of revenge exerted by the state. So in the US, for example, people are nursed to health to then be put on the electric chair, which is kind of perverse. Are drugs privacy? Why does the state get involved if I want to kill myself with whatever? And finally, China. China has this scoring system which they at least want to massively introduce. These are the points that you can score. You can lose these if you are in the wrong kind of flat, if you cross the road when there's a red traffic light. There is a social credit system that will preclude you from going to university, going abroad, getting a credit, whatever. And by behaving well, you can gain points or lose points as well. In America, I don't know about Germany, but there are student cards in the US for having your meals, going to the library, whatever. So of those people that enter the lectures, you may find out what they eat, what they read. That's not that different from the Chinese surveillance anymore. So I think there are certain parallels, and we don't really need the whole internet for surveillance anymore, because surveillance takes place and privacy is lost in many other places.
Eins, zwei, Test. Siehst du, mit Ton geht das gleich viel besser. Ganz herzlichen Dank, Regina. Gibt es gerade, also ich glaube, wir haben noch so ein...
Are there any questions? We do have like 1 or 2 minutes for questions. Do we have some short questions from the audience? Okay, there's none in the audience.
I've confused everyone so much.
I can add that this Chinese module of little walls between toilets. I've been at a dentist who had something very similar, and that is something that really frightened me out. However, if there are no questions currently, no? Okay. So, huge round of applause for Regina. Thanks. That was very interesting.